Okay, so here's another example of the interpreting the second derivative, and it's interpreting it in a numerical setting, and similar to the first example, but not exactly the same either. Let's start off with the bits of information that we're given. We're told that f prime of x is greater than 0. Well, what that means is that successive values of f of x, so if f prime of x gives you information about whether f of x is growing, increasing, or decreasing. And if f prime of x is greater than 0, is increasing, is positive, if f prime of x is positive, then successive values of f of x are increasing. Okay, so we have to be pretty clear about that, and I'm afraid I wasn't there. If f prime of x is positive, is greater than 0, then f of x is increasing. Well, if we look at that, then we can immediately rule out d and e, because if you look at the values of f of x in d, f of 8 is 15, f of 9 is 14, f of 10 is 12. So as the x's are going up, the f of x's are actually coming down, they're decreasing. So that's not what we want, that's the opposite of what we want. We want successive values of f of x to be increasing. So in other words, we want to find that as x goes up, f of x is going up. E also has the same problem, because when x is 8, f of x is 15. When x goes up to 9, f of x comes down to 11. So again, D and E are not going to fit the bill for us this time. D and E fail this test. Okay? So it's not going to be D or E. Now, let's move on to the second piece of information we're given, which is that f double prime of x is less than or equal to 0. Well, what that means is that the change between successive values of f of x is decreasing. Now, not the values themselves, that's the first derivative. When we talk about values themselves and whether they're going up or down, that's governed by or indicated by the first derivative. But when we look at the change between successive values, whether that change is increasing or decreasing, that is related to the second derivative. So we've already ruled out D and E. So let's draw the tables for A, B, and C. And this time we're going to add an extra column. So for A, we had x and f of x. And our extra column is going to be delta f of x, the change in f of x. For B, same 3 column headings. So f of x and delta f of x. And C, x, f of x, and delta f of x. Okay, so let's do it for each of the 3 groups. Now, A, 8, 9, and 10. Okay, those were the x values in each case, so we can fill those in without thinking too much about this. 9 and 10. F of x in A is 15, 18, and 21. In B, the f of x values are 15, 18, and 22. And in C, the f of x values are 15, 18, and 20. Okay, so let's look at the delta f of x. So what's the change in f of x between these first 2 values? And we can see that it's plus 3. And the change between these 2 values is also plus 3. So delta f of x doesn't change. Now that corresponds to the second derivative being equal to 0. Okay? The first derivative will be positive because the f of x is going up, so the first derivative is positive, as it is in all of these cases. So the first derivative is positive, but in the second case, there's no change in delta f of x. The change between successive values of x doesn't change at all. So the second derivative is going to be 0. In this case here, f of x changes from 15 to 18, so that's plus 3, and then from 18 to 22. So in this case, delta f of x is increasing. Okay, now if delta f of x is increasing, that means the second derivative is positive. So another way of saying that would be f prime of x is greater than 0. And again, as in all of these cases, f prime of x, the first derivative is always 0, simply because because f of x, the second column here, f of x is always going up. In the third example, in part C, the change in f of x between x is 8 and x is 9, the change in f of x is plus 3. And then here, the change in f of x is plus 2. So if we look at this column, delta f of x is actually decreasing. Delta f of x is decreasing. Now that corresponds to the second derivative being less than 0, negative. Let me try that again. Caught between two stools. So f double prime of x is negative. This is despite f of x increasing, so f prime of x remains positive in all of these cases. Okay. Now, when you look at what we were required to do, we were looking for the one that had f prime of x being positive. All three of them fit the bill. But f double prime of x being less than 0. Okay, f double prime of x being less than 0, and that happened in C. So the correct answer here is C. Okay, well, hopefully that makes sense. Alright, so what we have to look for is we have to look at the change in f of x. Okay, we want f of x first of all to be increasing. That was the original requirement. The second requirement was that delta f of x, or that f double prime of x was less than 0. And we recognize that by looking at the change in f of x and looking for that change to decrease.